Let's go over chapter 7, which is the bone chapter. So this is the first of 2 chapters on bone. So this is talking about the physiology of bone. And then we'll go into specific bones in the next chapter. And then I do believe, as is tradition, after that would be joints. All right, so anyhow, let's get into this. Let's get to the thing here. So what you're looking at here in this picture is actually bone, obviously, but really close up, so you can actually see the structure. So this is spongy bone. So it's really quite cool. Anyhow, so here are your learning outcomes, and as always, focus in on that study guide to get you ready for the test. This table, of course, is referring to the Saladin text, so if you have that, you can look at that. So those are several bone diseases. I think I'm covering all of the ones that are in the book and a few more here, just so that you're familiar with them. I had started putting some joint diseases in here too, but I think I decided to save that for chapter 8. Sorry, chapter 9. Okay, so functions of bone. You need to know those. So a lot of these are probably intuitive, right? So support, attachment for ligaments and tendons, and that's a little bit misleading because it's the ligaments that are bone to muscle. Some of the tendons run over structures on the bone. You know, tendons are muscle to muscle. Protection, that's probably also obvious, right? Your skull, your ribs, and your pelvis is protecting soft organs. Movement is probably something else that is intuitive. This next one is probably not one that you think of as the red marrow. You have blood cell formation there. That process of the formation of blood is called hematopoiesis, okay, hematopoiesis. I didn't write it down in my notes, but you will see it in your textbook, right? I kind of saved that term for when you do blood, which is in semester 2, but I noticed that the homework and the textbooks say the term, so hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells, all right? Then mineral storage, that you probably know, right? Storing your calcium, but you probably don't know about the phosphate. So the calcium is actually stored as a salt mixed with phosphate, and we will come up to that in a few minutes. That's called hydroxyapatite. And then fat storage and the yellow marrow. So the yellow marrow, we're going to look at the difference there. And as you get older, you get a bit more yellow marrow than you have red, but you know, that fat storage, if you see animals, they like to chew on bones, and people actually used to, you know, get the yellow marrow out because it's a good source of energy, right? Because it's fat. People don't tend to do that anymore, and we get plenty of fat elsewhere, but it used to be that would be something that would be done. The other thing is the types of bone, and when it talks about that, it's actually talking about these characteristic shapes. And I'd like you to kind of know examples of each of these bones. The one that's not on here, and I put it in my notes, are sutural bones, right? So those are ones, so we'll talk about it later, but you know, with your skull, when you're a baby, right, you know that infants, their skull is soft, right? And your skull is actually not fully formed until you're almost 20. But there are, you know, as the skull hardens over, you're going to learn the parts of the skull, the bones of the skull. But there's little bones that remain in between, and they're different in everyone, and they're called sutural bones. So they're not listed here. Then of course, you know, long bones I think are pretty obvious, right? So then there's flat bones, and they're really good for red marrow, particularly the bones in the pelvis are really good for red marrow as well. But flat bones, like your sternum, irregular bones have weird shapes. Short bones, these are like the ones in your wrists and your ankles. Those are really good examples. And then there's the sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones tend to be held in place by ligaments. And sometimes tendons, as they're, you know, muscle to muscle. And the one that's really obvious is the patella. But you might have sesamoid bones in your feet as well, and in your hands. And it depends on the wear and tear on different joints. So, yeah, and again, those are actually not numbered or named bones because they're going to be different in different people. So if you're a runner, very often you have them in your feet. Now, actually, I probably do. I've been running since I was 22, and now I'm much older than that. Um, so I probably have developed some in my feet, and that'd be kind of interesting to see a foot X-ray to see if I actually do. But that will tend to happen. All right. Okay, so let's get into the next part. So structure of the long bone. So this one you really got to learn. I use the long bone as an example for teaching. And so the main parts are the ends, which are the epiphysis, right, on each side. And then there is the diaphysis, which is the shaft. Now, there's this also, you might also see a term called the metaphysis. And the metaphysis, if you see it, is the area between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. So there would be a region here called the metaphysis. And if you look in my notes on page 2, I actually sketched that in there. It's not always shown, so I didn't put it on the slide. But you might see that in a book that you're looking at, because sometimes they do go into that level of detail. But for the most part, you'll see epiphysis. So epi means the outside or the ends of stuff, and the diaphysis is going to be the shaft, the middle part. Now, when it comes to the different marrows, in a long bone, the yellow marrow tends to be in the diaphysis, and the red marrow, where you have hematopoiesis, is in the epiphysis. And it's always in the medullary cavity, down the middle here. And some of that is where you've got this spongy bone, which I'll get into that. The marrow is sort of in the trabeculae of the spongy bone, all right? Now, on the outside of the bone, there is a layer of connective tissue called the periosteum, all right? And there are some fibers that hold this periosteum on here. It's not shown on this slide. I actually don't know if I have a slide that has those fibers on there. You don't always see the name. But again, I noticed them in your textbook, that they refer to these perforating fibers here, all right? I didn't include them here because it's not always there, but what I'm showing you are standard things that you'll see. But there's these perforating fibers that would hold the periosteum onto the bone proper, all right? Okay, other ideas that are here. Oh yes, and then when you have tendons, when you have ligaments, they grow out of the periosteum, so it's continuous with this connective tissue layer. Now, in the middle, you have an endosteum, right? So end would be inside, endosteum, connective tissue that's lining the medullary cavity. It's not shown on this particular slide, all right? Now, on the outside of the bone, well, on the outer layer of bone, right? So underneath the periosteum is a layer of bone that's called compact bone, all right? So compact bone is sort of on the outside area. And I'm going ahead in my notes, which I shouldn't do. Yeah, so compact bone. It's also called cortical bone, just so you know. And then in the middle, especially on the epiphysis, is where you have the spongy bone, and that has different names, sometimes called trabecular bone or cancellous bone. I wrote those terms on page 4 of my notes, okay? But your book is saying compact bone and spongy bone, all right? And you'll notice that there's these blood vessels that come in here. And then you also have blood vessels running down here. And bone is highly vascularized. And there's also nerves in here too. So this is why it hurts so much if you break a bone, because you're pressing down, the bone is going to press down on these nerves. And these vessels that come in from the side, they're coming in through these perforating canals versus perforating fibers, but perforating canals, sometimes they're called Volkmann's canals. And then these vessels here, these ones are running down the middle of a structure that's called the osteon, and you can see that here. So the osteon is actually a cylindrical structure down the compact bone, all right? And it runs the length of the bone, and it's really quite interesting. how this happens, all right? So it really is a 3D structure. I know when you look at these pictures of this in the lab, you don't get the idea that this is actually a column. And it's really wild because your bone is constantly remodeling. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So when you look at this, these slides of the ground bone in lab, sometimes you'll see pieces of osteons because that osteon has been remodeled into a new one, right? So you'll see the remains of that because you're not going to get holes, right? Because bone has to stay mineralized. So you'll see, like, you know, remnants of old osteons due to remodeling and reformation of the bone. I saw a figure once that said that your whole skeleton is renewed every 7 years. So you can take your age and divide it by 7, and you can see how many times you renewed your skeleton, which is really wild because you think of your bone as being like a static, hard thing, but it really isn't. Okay, I mean, it's hard, but it's not static. All right. Okay, and then I'm going to get into the actual structure of this osteon in a bit. But in the very middle of the osteon, there's this hole where these vessels are going through, and that's called the central canal. All right, and then you can see that these vessels and the nerves actually extend to the trabeculae of the spongy bone as well. All right, so it's not like there's no blood vessels and stuff here. Even if there's like red marrow, there's still blood vessels going through that. All right. Okay, so then you can see the osteocytes. They're in these little structures called lacunae, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in a bit. Basically, the osteocytes are sort of trapped inside the bone, and they're going to maintain the bone, and they're sitting in these spaces called lacunae. So I'm going to get in a little bit more detail there, but I just want to cover everything that's on this slide. Okay, now next slide. All right, so here's another look at the osteons. All right, so here again you can see, oh yeah, here this slide has the perforating fibers here that's holding down the periosteum. All right, and what I want you to see is that these rings around the osteon, so each of these rings are called lamellae. All right, and they're called concentric lamellae sometimes, and they look like tree rings, and that's basically what, you know, and then you can think of it like that in a way. Okay, but notice there's also lamellae that are running around the outside of the bone proper, and those are called circumferential lamellae. So they're ones, you know, sort of running around the entire bone, and then the osteons, they're the you know, the lamellae here. Okay, they're not circumferential, sometimes they're called concentric. Okay, now when you see this again, you know, the blood vessels and the nerve are running down the middle, and that's your central canal. And then you can see that each of these rings, there are these little spaces where the osteocytes are located. All right, so those osteocytes are located in these spaces, and the spaces are called lacunae. All right, so here you can see a zoom up of that. So there's your osteocyte sitting in here, and then there is this lacunae, which is, and lacunae actually stands for little lake. I'm not sure, I guess it's Latin, but little lake. So, because when you look at ground bone, when you look at them in lab, it looks like a dark space. The cells aren't going to be there anymore because the bone has been dried and ground. But it looks like the dye, that the contrast agent that's used, the contrast dye that's used, it causes this to look like a dark space, or like a little lake of darkness. So that's why they give it that name. And then between these lacunae, there are these like canals. And I'm going to explain what's in there in a bit, but these little spaces within the bone proper, and those little lines are called little canals, or canaliculi. All right. So that's sort of like the breakdown of this osteon. Now, spongy bone doesn't have osteons, all right? It still has these lamellae, and it's got in the little lacunae where the osteocytes are, but there's no central canal, and it's not quite set up that way. So these little, you know, little like channels of bone, they're called trabeculae. All right. That's why sometimes spongy bone is called trabecular bone, because they have these structures called trabeculae. And then sometimes there's even smaller trabeculae that are referred to as spines, but we don't see them in this picture. all right? Just want to see if there's anything else that I've not said that's in my notes. Yeah, I kind of, on page 2, I said, notice that bone is highly vascularized, and I sort of got into that as well. Oh, and then the other thing, I've got like the layers of bone, not the layers that you find in the long bone. So if we go, I have written superficial, then you've got your periosteum, okay? And then after that, you have your compact bone, so compact bone, and then you have your spongy bone, all right? And then, lining this medullary cavity where the marrow is, there's an endosteum, which you don't see in this picture, all right? They don't always label that, but it's another layer of connective tissue lining the cavity here, all right? Okay, now the types of cells. So we already talked about osteocytes, and I'd mentioned them before when we talked about the tissue. So that the cells that maintain bone are called osteocytes. But the cells are not born osteocytes, all right? So the way this works is there's a stem cell, a bone stem cell that's called an osteoprogenitor cell, all right? Sometimes it's called the osteogenic cell. So in my notes on the bottom of page 2, I list both, right? Because I don't know if you're using the Saladin text or if you're using another book. But sometimes it's called the osteogenic cell or the osteoprogenitor cell. And that's the stem cell, okay? And that stem cell, the next cell that it becomes as it becomes mature is an osteoblast, okay? So an osteoblast is, every time you see blast, that means something is being formed, all right? So osteo refers to bone. So osteo or osseous means bone. So this is a bone building cell, all right? And it is like the next stage from the osteoprogenitor cell. Now these, remember this guy's building bone. So he's gonna get trapped in the mineralization of the bone that he's created. I don't know why I'm saying he, but it has created. And then it's going to be trapped within the bone structure, and then it's going to stay there in those little lacunae, and that guy is then called an osteocyte. And what its job is to do is to maintain the bone. So it kind of, and I think they don't really understand yet how it does that, but there's this whole idea that these osteocytes can detect sort of forces on the bone and send signals whether the bone needs to be remodeled or not. All right, and I don't really know yet how it will do that, but I would imagine it's going to release some sort of factors of some kind into the blood, and it's going to send signals. And there's probably somebody who is, an expert on bone that would be able to explain that in great detail. All right. Now, the other kind of cell that we have are these cells called osteoclasts. They are not formed from this stem cell. These cells actually are derived from the bone marrow. And they're a type of phagocytic cell, but a really specialized one, all right? They're really big cells. They've got more than one nucleus in them, and they have this thing called a ruffled border. And it's at this point, on this side where this ruffle is, that these cells release enzymes and acid to degrade bone, all right? So, but they're not formed from this same stem cell. They're in a separate lineage, all right? And if you look on this slide, they give us sort of like a general idea of where you find these types of cells predominantly, all right? That doesn't mean that's the only place you'll find them, but they say like the osteogenic cell tends to be out here. And then the osteoblast is also sort of in that area. Of course, the osteocytes are going to be within the bone that's been mineralized. And then the osteoclasts, they always sort of indicate them as being sort of towards the medullary cavity, all right? But there must be some in other locations, otherwise bone wouldn't be able to be completely remodeled, all right? But I think the indication is to give you an idea of where they mostly reside, all right? So on page 3, I have osteoblast versus osteoclast, okay? I know my C is a little close to that L there, but that's osteoclast. Okay, so the osteoblast is formed from the osteogenic cell. It takes calcium from the blood and incorporates it into the bone matrix. And the osteoclast is derived from hematopoietic stem cells in the macrophage line, so blood cells. And these are really big cells with multiple nuclei and a ruffled border, and they release calcium to the blood by breaking down bone. Okay, so these two cell types, the blasts and the clasts, work together when you're remodeling bone. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. Okay, so here you have your osteogenic cells. Another, so I think this one is from the Saladin text. It's quite a nice sort of idea. So you use your osteogenic cell, you make your osteoblast, and these guys are going to be building bone and eventually become osteocytes. And notice there's all these extensions here, all right? So I'm going to come back to these extensions in a sec, all right? Because these are really important, all right? So we're going to talk about those when I talk about the osteon, all right? Now, the osteoclasts are made from stem cells that as they mature along this lineage, and these stem cells are along with the hematopoietic stem cells, they'll start to fuse and they make these big cells with multiple nuclei and a ruffled border that sort of sit in these little cavities that are going to resorb or break down bone. You notice they call it the resorption bay because that's where the cell is sort of sitting in like a little space because it sort of breaks down the bone around it and it sits in there. All right. Now, the bone matrix itself. So I teach chemistry as well, as some of you know. And in that chemistry class I teach, I get to talk about composites in terms of organic polymers. It's kind of weird to think of bone as the same way, but it is also a composite. So basically what a composite is a mixture of a ceramic and a polymer. Which sounds weird, right? But the ceramic is sort of like a mineralized part. When you talk about ceramics, usually in chemistry, you're thinking of like a clay of some kind, right? And you're dealing with like a calcium salt with some sort of mineral like magnesium or manganese in it. But here you can sort of think about the same things. You got calcium polymer, calcium salts, but the calcium is like calcium and phosphate, all right? So, and then the polymer is actually collagen, right? So collagen is, one of your fibers. You've all heard of collagen. It's a protein, and it's a big, long polymer of protein. And so basically you've got the collagen there. It gives sort of tensile strength as well, and a bit of flex. And then the ceramic makes it hard and strong, all right? So this collagen is going to hold the ceramic together, right? So hydroxyapatite is a mixture as a salt of calcium and phosphate, and there's other minerals in there like fluoride and stuff like that. And then that goes in with the polymer, all right? So the ceramic portion allows the bone to support the body weight without sagging, and the polymer gives it some strength and flexibility, all right? So this is the biological component, and this is the inorganic component. So the organic versus the inorganic, all right? So if you look in my notes, page 3, the organic is pretty much a third of the bone, so that would be your collagen. And the inorganic is about 2/3 of it, all right? So the collagen, ironically, is actually produced, it's sort of like what they call it osteoid, so like the organic component is actually produced by the osteoblasts. Since it's a fiber, you'd think it's also produced by fibroblasts, but in this case, it's actually produced by the osteoblasts. We use the fibroblasts when we're repairing bones, so we'll talk about that in a bit. And then the osteoblasts then secrete or make this hydroxyapatite, the calcium phosphate salts, calcium carbonate, and they also incorporate other minerals. So you can see them listed there: fluoride, sodium and potassium and magnesium. All right. So the polymer is going to give flexibility and strength, and the ceramic is going to give the support. All right. So combining those two things together, a polymer with the ceramic makes a composite. So anytime you mix two kinds of materials together, you get a composite. All right. So that's the idea there. Now let's look again at the osteon. Here's my dedicated osteon slides. All right. So here, this is the model. This model is very similar to the one we have in lab, which is why I like this one. So this is your osteon checklist, right? So remember, the central canal is going to be down the middle of the osteon, right? And that's where you got your arteries, your vein, and your nerve, all right? There's also lymphatics there, which I don't know if that's included in our model in the lab or not, all right? But these major vessels are down the middle along with the nerve. And then you've got these concentric rings of hardened matrix, all right, which are the lamellae, or the concentric lamellae. All right. Now, the really interesting thing, notice that it's drawn in two different colors, and they're doing this on purpose to let you know that these layers really are different. And they're so different, like the collagen fibers that are made there, they're actually at different angles to each other. All right. So they actually, so that increases the strength of the bone to shear forces if they have the fibers of collagen in different orientations in these different lamellae. All right. I can't remember if they're right angles to each other or not. I can't remember anymore. But anyway, but they are in a different angle. And then in between these lamellae, you've got these little spaces again. Remember, those are called the lacunae. And inside of those little spaces are the osteocytes. Okay. Now, this model is done exactly like in the lab, where they put these lines here where you have the little spaces as the canaliculi, and it always gives students the impression that there's blood in here. There isn't. I don't know why they do it red. That is like probably the dumbest thing that they could do on the model, but it's exactly like the model in lab. It's not because there's blood here. They're just trying to highlight it so that you can see it. They should still draw them blue like they have this osteocyte, because what's in these canaliculi are actually extensions, right? So remember back here, I said to you, look at the extensions on these osteocytes. These extensions of these osteocytes feed into the canaliculi that are surrounding that are surrounding the osteocyte in that lacuna. Okay. Now I'm going to explain why that's important in a sec. All right. So that's what's in there, right? So here you can sort of see this whole thing. Now, remember I had said to you that sometimes there's little bits of old lamellae from old osteons that have been remodeled. Those things are called interstitial lamellae. So they're sort of like filling in the spaces between these columns because they're what's left over. And when you look at your bone slides, this is not a really good picture, so you can hardly see it. But when you look at your slides in lab, you'll see them, right? And remember the circumferential lamellae, they're on the outer side, right? Like they're all the way around. So let me go back so that you guys don't get confused, right? So the circumferential are all the way around, okay? Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, let's go over there. Okay, and then there's also those perforating canals that go sort of horizontally through to bring in more blood supply, all right? Okay, now remember what I said with those extensions of the osteocytes going into these canaliculi, all right? So this is what it looked like on the ground bone with this. But I want you to appreciate it in 3 dimensions. Okay, so here's sort of a 3D drawing of that. So here's an osteocyte, and here are these extensions. And notice here's another. This one would be in another lacuna over here, okay? And notice how these extensions are touching each other, right? So what's happening here is that the osteocytes from these different regions of the bone touch each other through these canaliculi. And what you find there are gap junctions. Okay, so remember this is highly vascularized tissue, but these cells are trapped in these layers of bone. So the way they get nutrients to each other, to itself, and then deposit waste back in the blood is sort of like a hot potato system or a bucket brigade from cell to cell to cell. So just say, so the other thing that they call the central canal is the Haversian canal, just so you know. Sometimes you'll see that. So the central canal is called the Haversian canal. But imagine now you've got blood vessels in the Haversian canal or the central canal, as well as, you know, at right angles to that through the perforating canals. And you've got to transport nutrients from that blood and waste to that blood from cells that are, you know, remote from there. So what they do is they pass that stuff, those nutrients and waste, between cells. You know, so say this cell is closer to a blood vessel and this one needs some nutrition. So the nutrition can be passed through the gap junctions to the cell. And then if this cell then has some waste that needs to go back to the blood so that it can be cleaned out, it will go through this cell, right? So this is why we've got these different these gap junctions between these different osteocytes. So it's really, really an interesting way that these cells manage to do things, all right? And they communicate with each other. So I said to you that they're trying to understand how the osteocytes signal that the bone has to be remodeled in different ways. And you can imagine that these cells are in a way communicating with each other. You know, they're sending signals. So that could be how it's done, right? So I'm not even going to pretend that I know exactly how it's done, but I could hypothesize how it could be done based upon what I know about cells, all right? Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so spongy bone, right? Spongy bone in relation to mechanical stress. All right, so remember with the spongy bone, you have these trabeculae. And the really interesting thing here is, okay, so remember you've got the lattice, and this is in the middle part, and it's covered with the endosteum, right? And these trabeculae, or these beams of bone, what they do, and this is the weird thing, I think I put it down here at the bottom. These trabeculae, they develop along lines of stress in the bone, all right? So if you look at this one, you can sort of see a line of stress. You can sort of see how the trabeculae are aligning that way. And this way here, so they've kind of drawn it in here, so you can see the different lines of stress based upon the way these trabeculae are oriented, all right? Now, the reason, so imagine how heavy the bone would be if we didn't have this, the spongy bone, right? So the trabeculae, the way it orients itself along stress lines, and because it's not completely full of these columns of bone like you have in the compact bone, it provides strength, but not as much weight, right? So that's really important to understand that, okay? Here, the osteocytes in general, they're quite close because the bone marrow is sort of all over, like surrounding these tissues here. And here you can have another look at it. Here you can see your osteoclasts and your osteocytes, and how they're sort of arranged here. And then the osteoblasts are supposed to be out here, all right? Yeah, let me just see, is there anything else that I need to tell you? So spongy bone is a bit different from, yeah, few osteons, no central canal. I'm on page 5. Bone lattice forms along stress lines. The periosteum, so I had said this before, the periosteum is that outer layer of connective tissue, and it's supposedly associated with the osteoblasts. And the endosteum, the inner part, osteoblasts and clasts, and extensive blood supply, like I was saying. Okay. So let's keep looking at, oh yeah, here. So here's your periosteum, again, attached by the perforating fibers, right? I don't show the fibers on here, but remember the fibers are on this other, it's hard to get a picture that has everything in it, right? So here's your perforating fibers. I didn't even write about them in my notes because you don't always see them. And then on the endosteum, it's lining the medullary cavity. So that's on the inner part, all right? Okay. Blood supply, right? So this is extensive blood supply. So here you can see this picture has the metaphysis on it. So you can see, I know it's a little fuzzy, but it's got all of this stuff in. And you're not going to have to learn this, but I want to show you this extensive blood supply, and that they actually have names for all of these veins and arteries, depending on where they're located, all right? Just so that you can see that and get an idea of what that is, right? So the blood supply of bones, you've got periosteal arteries, nutrient arteries, epiphyseal arteries, and metaphyseal arteries, right? So depending on where they're extending into the bone network, right? And you don't see this in lab, right? So you look at the bones in lab, and some of the bones are real bone, all right? You don't see any of these vessels, obviously. You just see what's left over, the mineralized part. So you don't see this, but this sort of gives you a good idea. This is why sometimes I sacrifice having a picture that's a little fuzzy just so that you can get, you know, the idea here. It's really hard to find a picture that you really have, that really has everything I'm trying to share. Okay, so blood calcium levels are affected by hormones. So there's this whole idea of hormones that we have to sort of talk about. And in this picture here, before I start showing the text, you can see it's talking about PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, which is calcitriol, which is actually hormone. And then you can see, do I have the other one on here? I don't. I don't even mention this hormone here. But there, so we've got parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, and the one that's missing is, so this is calcitriol, calcitonin is missing. But the main hormone is parathyroid hormone. And the vitamin D is also very active. That's why they didn't list calcitonin, because it's not as active in the adults, all right? But we will go over that. All right, so mineral deposition, all right? So what does that mean? Mineral deposition or mineralization, right? So remember, it's those osteoblasts. You're gonna lay down your organic component, which is your polymer, right? So collagen, and your mineralized part, or your ceramic. So you got your calcium phosphate and other ions. They're going to be taken from the blood and deposited in the bone, right? And they're going to be done, that's going to be happened by these osteoblasts that produce these collagen fibers that run the length of the osteon, all right? So these fibers are then going to be encrusted with these minerals, right? Namely hydroxyapatite crystals. And they have mostly calcium and some phosphate in there, all right? Then let's keep going here. Mineral resorption, all right? So mineral resorption is the process of dissolving the bone and then releasing those minerals back to the blood if you need them. And that's performed by the osteoclasts at this little ruffled border, all right? So you can see here from in this picture, you can see these little pluses. So what this means is referring that you're going to release hydrogen, all right? So hydrogen is going to mix in with chloride ions in here, and you know, hydrogen chloride, right? That makes hydrochloric acid, right? So hydrochloric acid, so they make sort of like an acidic zone here. That acid is going to help dissolve the bone and release those minerals, along with an enzyme, a protease, that's going to digest the collagen under this ruffled border of these osteoclasts. Okay, so remember, if you look back here at my osteoclast, right, it's sort of in this little bay of like a space here because of the acid and the enzyme, all right? It doesn't, they don't name the enzyme. I don't know why they don't do that. I used to work with proteolytic enzymes, so it kind of irritates me that they don't give the name here. I'd have to actually look it up in some papers, but which I didn't do, so I apologize. But it's a protease, so that means it breaks down protein. Now, so the hormones, so let's get into these, right? So I mentioned it didn't show calcitonin, it showed vitamin D and parathyroid hormone, which should work in the same kind of thing here. So let's talk about how this works. So now, over the lifetime of a human, and there's different hormones have different activities, right? So, and there's a balance between mineralization and demineralization, right? So mineral deposition and resorption, all right? So there's a balance between that. And notice this is a little kid here, and this is sort of an older kid here. Maybe this is mom, all right? And that's to imply that it also changes over the lifetime, right? So you've probably heard of a hormone called growth hormone, and you'll hear more about it when you take AMP2. But growth hormone, the H just stands for human. So growth hormone, it's going to be stimulating those osteoblasts in childhood to build that skeleton, all right? And then, of course, the sex hormones, so testosterone and estrogen, also have a role to play. And it's kind of complicated because at a certain concentration, these hormones are going to be causing the building of bone. But when those hormones get to another concentration, they're going to make it stop. All right, so it's sort of a concentration level. And notice how, and you know that girls tend to get bigger before boys. And that's because they have more estrogen. And estrogen is a stronger, it has a stronger incentive gives the body a stronger incentive to build bone at a younger age in girls. Whereas testosterone, it kicks in later and lasts longer for boys, and that's why they ultimately will grow taller. But eventually that estrogen is going to cause we'll talk about the growth plate in a sec, but cause it to seal over and stop growth. So that's why girls also stop growing before boys do in general, all right? So the sex hormones are kind of complicated, but they do have a role to play, and it depends on the concentration of them, all right? And exactly which sex hormone you're talking about. But that's why the sex hormones and human growth hormone are listed over here. In calcitonin, I had said to you that was the hormone that isn't shown here, because calcitonin, I'm going to talk about it in a sec, has a bigger role to play when you're young than when you're older. Now, the main hormone, though, especially in the adults, that controls whether your bones are being built or breaking down, so whether you're releasing calcium or putting it into your body, the levels of this hormone, parathyroid hormone, are going to be the main controller there, along with calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D, all right? So parathyroid hormone, what its job is to raise blood calcium levels, all right? So its levels in the body are going to increase when blood calcium levels are low. And it is going to then raise blood calcium levels by 4 different methods, okay? So one thing it's going to do is it's going to stimulate the osteoblasts to secrete this hormone, rank L. And what that does is increase the osteoclast activity, all right? So it's going to ultimately, even though it has an effect on osteoblasts, it's going to cause bones to break down because they're ultimately going to increase the activity of the osteoclasts. Now, I know that sounds really weird, and if you took 105 with me, all I said to you is parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts, all right? Because that's ultimately the result, all right? So parathyroid hormone is going to stimulate osteoclast activity. It's also going to stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb calcium from the urine, so it's going to put it back in the blood. It's going to promote the final step of calcitriol synthesis in the kidneys. And we already went over that a little bit before in the course, but I'm going to review that with you, what vitamin D does. All right, so calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D, and parathyroid hormone is needed for that to be made. All right, so, and we'll go over what calcitriol does in a sec. And then, but basically it has to do with resorbing calcium from the gut, so from your food. Then the other thing it's going to do is it's going to inhibit the osteoblasts. It's going to prevent them from synthesizing collagen, all right? So if there's no collagen, there's no fibers for the osteoblasts to mineralize, all right? So, so parathyroid hormone ultimately stimulates osteoclast activity, prevents the activity of osteoblasts, allows you to absorb calcium from the filtrate in your kidneys so it doesn't get lost in the urine, and will also help you absorb calcium from your food by stimulating the last step in the synthesis of active vitamin D, which takes place in the kidneys, all right? So that's parathyroid hormone, right? So now calcitriol, remember, and I've used this picture before, right? This little GIF with the sun here. So remember vitamin D synthesis. And vitamin D, active vitamin D, is actually a hormone called calcitriol. So again, it's formed in several stages, right? So, so when we talked about skin, we talked about this part, right? So the keratinocytes are going to use that UV radiation, and they're going to convert 7-dehydroxycholesterol, which is a form of cholesterol with a hydroxy missing, to pre-vitamin D3. Okay, so, and that's what it's called here, cholecalciferol, okay? And that is going to travel by the blood to the liver, okay? So liver then is going to has an enzyme in there that's going to add a hydroxyl group to the cholecalciferol, all right? And that's going to, and it's being put to a 25 position of the structure of cholesterol. You don't need to know where that is, but it has a hydroxyl group there. And then that's going to travel by the blood to the kidney. And lo and behold, in the kidney, when it encounters parathyroid hormone, that is going to add another hydroxyl group to the structure in the number 1 position. And now you have your active form of vitamin D, or as we call it, the hormone calcitriol. Okay, so that's again the synthesis steps. So what does calcitriol do? I sort of, indicated that already, but what it does is it helps to absorb calcium in the small intestine, right? So I had mentioned when we were doing skin that if you want to absorb calcium in your gut, you need vitamin D, right? So if you're taking a vitamin, or if you're taking the mineral calcium, you need to get the formulation with the D3 in it. So someone who has osteoporosis takes a combo D3 calcium, right? Because you need the D3 to help you absorb that calcium from your gut. Now, calcium is also going to help bring calcium out of the bone, very much like parathyroid hormone, by stimulating the osteoclasts, and ironically, by telling the osteoblasts to release this cytokine, rank L, all right? And then it also very weakly helps the kidney reabsorb calcium from the filtrate, so it doesn't go into the urine, all right? So again, so what does calcitriol do? Well, it helps to absorb the calcium from the gut, stimulates osteoclast activity by increasing the number of those guys, and helps a little bit to bring in some calcium from the filtrate, all right? Okay, so that's its 3 roles. Now, calcitonin, now this is the other hormone that I mentioned to you. Now, calcitonin is active on the other side of the calcitriol and the parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is released when you have high blood calcium, right? And where does it come from? Well, it comes from the thyroid gland. There's a structure in the thyroid gland where you've got follicles, and there's these C cells that are on the outside of the follicles. You've got F cells that make the follicle, and you have another hormone in there, which you'll learn about next semester. But calcitonin is produced by the C cells, which are outside the follicles. And its job is to lower blood calcium, all right? So it's released when you have high blood calcium, and its job then is to lower it. And how does it do that? Well, it's going to be opposite to what you just read, what we just went over for calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. So what it's going to do is it's going to inhibit osteoclast activity, so therefore reducing resorption of bone. It's going to stimulate osteoblast activity to deposit calcium into the bone. And it's going to promote loss of urine into the filtrate so that you'll just pee that out, all right? It's more important in children. It's not as functional in adults, all right? And the reason that is that the osteoclasts are a lot more active in children due to the remodeling that's taking place there. So you really need to have an extra balance on those osteoclasts, all right? The other thing it might help is to inhibit bone loss in pregnant women, lactating women, as you're making milk, right? So you don't want to do that. You need to keep your bones strong, all right? So here you've got your balance between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. And you can see that, we've got the opposite. So imagine now we've got your balance, right? And if you have the stimulus here, you've got rising levels of calcium. And then the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin, and it's then going to stimulate calcium deposition to the bones and reduce calcium uptake by the kidneys. And then on the other side, you've got, falling blood calcium levels, and parathyroid hormone is going to go crazy, right? And it's going to increase calcium uptake by the intestines by stimulating the production of active vitamin D. And then on the other side, you're going to increase calcium uptake by the kidney and then stimulate calcium release from the bones because of the increased activity of the now more in number osteoclasts. All right, so they're working to balance each other. Right, so here one more time to make sure that you've got this. So the balance between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Here on the top, you've got the effect due to low blood calcium and how to raise that, right? So you have low blood calcium. What you're going to do is then drop down your levels of, so you've got low blood calcium, so you need to raise blood calcium. So you're going to increase your levels of parathyroid hormone and you're going to lower your levels of calcitonin, all right? So that way you're going to save calcium from the kidneys, absorb it from the digestive tract using vitamin D, right? And you're going to release calcium from the bone. And then if you have a higher blood calcium, all right, what you then do is going to lower the levels of parathyroid hormone. You're going to increase the levels of calcitonin coming out of the thyroid gland, and you're going to increase the uptake by the bone by stimulating those osteoblasts. You're going to have less absorption from the kidney and from the gut, all right? So there's your balance between these two. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So make sure you can wrap your head around that. And then if there's a question that says, what is the major hormone that controls blood calcium levels, your answer is going to be parathyroid hormone, because we're thinking about it in terms of the adults, all right? And the reason that works is because the osteoclasts are less active in the adults. But of course, as we age, there's going to be a whole other issue that takes place. And I didn't really talk too much about that, but I'll sort of mention it a little bit when we get into osteoporosis, all right? So here, now I really want you to understand this whole balance between calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. And this here, again, is going to reinforce that difference. And here you've got you want to maintain a homeostatic level of about 8 to 11 milligrams per 100 mils of blood of calcium, all right? So your calcium homeostasis, remember homeostasis is balance, right? So if you have an imbalance towards rising calcium levels, your thyroid gland is going to produce calcitonin, and you're going to then ultimately be able to build that bone, and then you're going to lower that calcium, and then you're going to also allow for calcium to go out through the kidney, and you're not going to absorb as much from the gut. And then if you have falling blood calcium levels, you need to raise those. So the parathyroid gland then is going to release parathyroid hormone, and that's going to stimulate those osteoclasts on several levels, right? Because you're also going to stimulate the production of calcitriol or vitamin D, which is also going to stimulate these guys. And then you're going to retain more calcium from your diet, as well as not pee it out as easily either. All right, so there's that balance there. So hopefully going over that, you've got it. Now, calcium homeostasis is really important. So if you're in a state of deficient calcium in the blood, that's called hypocalcemia. All right, so hypocalcemia, hypo always means less. What can that happen? What can that happen? What can happen as a result of that is that you have overly excitable nervous system, and that leads to tetanus. So tetany, so muscle spasms, and then laryngospasm is really dangerous because that can cause suffocation. So your larynx is in your throat, and the muscles there are going to close off your air passage. And then in pregnancy and lactation pregnancy and lactation obviously increases the risk of hypocalcemia as you're taking calcium and putting it into milk, all right? Now, hypercalcemia is when you have too much calcium for an extended period, so excessive. So this is going to cause the opposite. So you're going to make the ion channels less responsive now, and you're going to have muscle weakness, all right? And you can get cardiac arrest, so sluggish reflexes. Now, calcitriol, right, so vitamin D, is also needed for bone deposition because it helps you absorb calcium from your diet. And if you have inadequate calcitriol levels, that can lead to an abnormal softening of the bone. And this can happen in both adults and in children, but it's just given a different name depending on whether it's a child or an adult. So in children, it's called rickets. So here's a child with rickets, and you can sort of see that the softening of the bones causes this characteristic bending of the leg bones. In adults, it's called osteomalacia. But it's the same thing, and it's because of a poor diet poor calcium in the diet. All right. Here it says electrolyte imbalance. That's sort of referring to this. Okay. I'm way past my notes here, so let me just get caught up here. Page 6, we've got the 3 hormones, growth hormone, sex hormone, okay, I'm on page 7 now. Now, giantism and dwarfism. All right, so giantism, it occurs as a result of excess growth hormone during childhood. And this is because the growth plates, or the epiphyseal plates, are open. I'm going to talk about what those are in a sec. And this allows long bones to grow to unusual lengths. So these two are actually twins. And you can sort of see the difference in the proportioning here. So one is giantism and one does not. So here, 22-year-old man with his identical twin. And then we have dwarfism. There's just different types depending. So we have pituitary dwarfism, and this is a result of too little growth hormone during childhood. And you can provide the hormone for treatment. But with a pituitary dwarf, this person is normally proportioned. I don't want to say properly proportioned because it makes the dwarf sound like this other type of dwarfism that makes them stand abnormal. But what I say is has a normal proportions. So it's just that the person would then be small, okay? This other kind is achondroplastic dwarfism. And what's happening here is that the long bones stop growing in childhood, right? So the torso, and here you can see that type of dwarf, the torso remains normal, but the limbs are short. So that's what's happening here. So we would say it's an abnormally proportioned person. And this chondro means is cartilage. And we're going to talk about this. So the cartilage isn't growing in the metaphysis, and I'm going to, that will be apparent when I talk about this. So this is a genetic mutation that's happening here. Pituitary dwarfism could happen for other reasons, but this is a genetic mutation. Okay. Now, if you have excess growth hormone during adulthood, that produces something called acromegaly or acromegaly. And what's happening here? So here, the long bones, the epiphyseal plates have sealed. And again, I'll talk about what that is in a sec. But other parts of the bone structure could still elongate. So you have an elongation of the bones in the face, of the jaw, and then the hands. But those of the other extremities are unaffected because the growth plates have closed, right? So this is the difference here. So you won't have a giantism. You'll have this thing called acromegaly, right? Now, we have to talk about bone formation, right? So then these growth plates and all of that's going to make sense, all right? So there's two ways that bone is formed, all right? So the first one that I'm going to talk about is something called intramembranous ossification. And this only happens in the fetus, all right? So and basically it's bone formed from de novo. So there's no form, all right? And that will make more sense in a minute. But basically it's formed directly from the mesenchyme tissue. So all of a sudden you're going to have your developmentally, there's going to be a signal for the formation of osteoblasts. So if you look at my notes, I have the 3 steps. So you have the formation of these ossification centers in the mesenchymal connective tissue, all right? And these osteoblasts, so the mesenchymal cells mature into osteoblasts. And the osteoblasts are going to secrete the osteoid, which is then going to be mineralized, and it's going to trap those osteoblasts in there and get osteocytes. And then blood vessels are going to be attracted into that tissue, all right? Intramembranous ossification is also important for bone thickening throughout life. But But in general, it's something that you identify with what's happening in the fetus. And the bones that are formed in that way in the fetus are the flat bones, so the skull, clavicle, and part of the mandible. All right, so that's where you're going to have that intramembranous ossification taking place. All right. So here you can sort of see these, these steps here. So you have this mesenchymal cell is going to become an osteoblast, and it's going to start secreting the collagen fibers in the osteoid. And then they're going to start mineralizing that and getting stuck in there. So you're going to have osteocytes in there, and then the osteoblasts are going to keep doing that on the outside in these ossification centers. And eventually that's going to bring in some blood vessels, and you're going to have sort of this bone that looks like spongy bone or trabeculi. And you're going to have some connective tissue out here, which will eventually form the periosteum. All right, so that fiber out there. And then this bone is going to be remodeled to form this compact bone on the outside. All right. Now you can see this term, it might show up in your textbook. I'm not even sure how to pronounce this. I think I'm going to guess diplue. But that's what we call the spongy bone in the middle of a flat bone. And then here, I wanted to include this because you can sort of see this happening here. This is actually a histological section where you can sort of see the mesenchyme and osteoblasts starting to form, and you're going to get these little spicules of bone. And that's what's stained here in red. So it's not blood, it's bone. So they used a dye that binds to bone and shows it as red. So I don't want you to think this is blood. It's not. All right. Now, the other type of bone formation is called endochondrial ossification. Chondro always implies cartilage, all right? So that will help you keep you straight when you're studying, all right? So basically what's happening with this kind is that first you have a cartilage model, and then that becomes ossified, all right? Basically you've got this cartilage, and in this kind of cartilage in an adult is limited to the hyaline cartilage or the articular cartilage at the ends of the bone or on the epiphyseal plates, which I'm going to talk about here. So the epiphyseal plate or the growth plate persists through adolescence and it serves as a zone of elongation using endochondrial ossification. All right, so let's go over the steps. There's a few more steps to that. But I want you to see this growth plate. So if you took an X-ray of a young person, so you can see 3-year-old, you would see these two. This is the femur, and it looks like there's like an extra bone here. But this is actually, because remember at X-ray, it's going to show denser material is white. All right, because the X-rays are going to be inhibited to pass through in here. So this is actually cartilage here. All right, in this space. So it's not like there's a gap and two bones. This is still the femur. And in the femur of the, or in any long bones, the tibia, you can see the same thing. There's a growth plate here. And the reason it looks dark is because it's not ossified yet, because it's cartilage, all right? So here you've got this cartilage forming here, and this is gradually going to be calcified, all right? And in my notes, I kind of go over this. I'll talk about it again. So, and eventually, when you're completed puberty and you become an adult, this is going to get filled in, and you'll see a brightening here, which is called the epiphyseal line, where you're going to see this all calcified, and it no longer looks like a space in an X-ray. So this is how they can tell if a skeleton is of a young person or someone who's mature, because this would be filled in, right? So by the late teens to early 20s, all of that remaining cartilage in the epiphyseal plate is going to be consumed. And this seeming gap is going to be closed, all right? So the bone can no longer grow in length, all right? And you've got a growth plate on both sides of the bone. So it's going to be growing on both sides, right? So imagine now that this is going to be expanding out as the bone gets longer, as the bone is going to grow in this direction, all right? And then you've got this layering of cartilage, and then cartilage that's multiplying, and then older cartilage, and then cartilage that's being calcified, and then mature bone, all right? And that's going to happen on each side of this growth plate, all right? So this order is like, you know, this part of the growth plate, but understand that it would go again. And if you look on my, so if you look on page 10, I kind of give you the full sandwich, right? So I have resting cartilage as actually in the middle of this, you know, extending, you know, calcifying cartilage that's extending out from here, okay? Now, and then here's another look at this, all right? So, you know, so here, this is actually called interstitial growth. I noticed that your textbook, if you're using the Saladin text, calls this interstitial growth, so growth that causes the lengthening of the bone. So this is where the osteoblasts in the growth plate are going to cause the increasing length of the bone. And but obviously, as you get older, your bone's also getting thicker, right? So there's osteoblasts that are underneath the periosteum, and they're laying down bone here, which is going to cause the bone to get thicker. And this is called appositional growth, all right? So interstitial growth and appositional growth. I don't always see the term interstitial growth, but I sort of noticed it in your homework, just so that you know what that is, all right? Now, how does this take place, all right? So I sort of talked about the growth plate. I probably should have shown this slide before talking about the growth plate. But basically what's happening here, and this is if you're looking at the fetus, so now you're looking at the long bones in the fetus. So in the first 2 months, you get this cartilage model. And what's happening there is that the mesenchymal cells, and I'm looking now on page 9 of my notes, so the mesenchymal cells, they become, instead of developing into osteoblasts like they did with the intramembranous ossification, what they are now becoming are chondroblasts. So they're going to lay down cartilage, all right? And the type of cartilage that they lay down is hyaline cartilage. And they lay down in the shape of the bone. And this is going to be surrounded by not a periosteum, but a perichondrium, so a connective tissue layer around the cartilage. So as this cartilage is going to expand, now remember, cartilage does not have very good vasculature, right? So it's not very well, it's kind of like a thick thing, and it doesn't have a lot of nutrition, all right? But notice you also have interstitial growth as well as appositional growth of that cartilage, all right? So I list that point 2 on page 9. So interstitial growth is increasing length, and appositional growth is increasing the thickness of that cartilage, all right? But eventually those chondroblasts are going to start to die off because you've got a poor blood supply, right? So then what's going to happen is that cartilage is going to start to dissolve, which sounds counterintuitive, all right? But when that starts to happen, it sends out signals into the body, all right, into the body of the fetus. And that's going to stimulate the development of a periosteum. So, so some of these cells are going to now become osteoblasts, and they're going to start laying down a periosteum out here with a tissue here, and they're going to start laying down what we call a bony collar, all right? And that is going to, also bring in blood vessels into the cartilage that is starting to break down here, all right? So if you look at point 3, so poor blood supply, so the chondroblasts are going to start to die off. A periosteum, an outer layer of bone, is going to start to develop. So that's called a bony collar. And then as blood vessels are attracted to that area, and they're going to bring with them osteoblasts, all right? And then these blood vessels are going to start to go into the actual tissue and bring osteoblasts into the actual dissolving cartilage. Those osteoblasts, now point 5, are now going to start to secrete osteoid and really start to form ossification centers in the bone proper, in this long bone, right? So it happens first in the shaft or in the diaphysis. So we call this sort of the primary ossification center. And then it's going to start happening in the epiphysis. And remember, you're going to have your growth plate here. So that cartilage is going to sort of stay here, and you're going to get a secondary ossification center in the epiphysis here, whereas the diaphysis would be the primary ossification center. And these secondary ones are going to get really active after birth, okay? And then eventually those trapped osteoblasts are going to become osteocytes in this forming bone. And then here, this is going to persist as the child grows, and then you're going to have this cartilage growth here, and you're going to keep going with that process until the end of adolescence, right? Until the growth plate closes up. And it tends to close up sooner in girls, all right? So hopefully that sort of goes through this. Now, throughout life, though, remember I said that you're going to constantly be remodeling bone all the way through life, all right? So in this video here, it's not particularly informative. It just sort of gives you sort of an animation of that process. It's produced by a drug company, so it's, so they produce drugs that sort of help maintain bone. But bone remodeling, absorption, and deposition is going to occur throughout life. So why does that happen? Well, you can get little microfractures, so you want to sort of seal those up, reshape the bone in response to changing use of the bone. There's this thing called Wolff's Law. So that's basically the architecture of the bone is going to be determined by the mechanical stresses that is placed on it, okay, that are placed on it. So in order for this to happen, and the meaning of this picture is to reinforce the idea that remodeling is it has to be collaborative and well orchestrated process between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. And if that goes off balance, then disease happens, all right? So you really have to have a fine balance between the two. Now, what kind of things can happen? Oh, this one here. This is to emphasize that changing stresses on the bone sends signals to the bone proper, and it's going to remodel. So you can see here, there's a greater curvature here, and then because of some sort of change in stress on this femur, I know it's a femur because I can tell you, it's going to change the curvature of that femur in response to that. Right. So think, for example, I really started running when I was 22. And then as I started running, I actually noticed that things, not only did my muscles get bigger, but things fit a little differently just because my shape changed a little bit. And that's just my bones adjusting to the new stresses of me running. And during the COVID here, I've actually started running more because I couldn't go to the gym. So I've noticed that things are changing again, but that's just I know it's not been 7 years, but I can feel different stresses on my bones, and I know that is having an effect on my skeleton, all right? Now, unusual curvatures of the spine. This is something that can happen. So scoliosis, what's happening here is you've got uneven shoulders and waist, so it's sort of side to side kind of curvature change. And this is developmental kind of thing, and I don't really know the exact cause, but I do know that a lot of young, for some reason, mostly girls have this. Then we have kyphosis, which is when you're hunching forward. So this is very often associated with osteoporosis, but it can also be associated with poor diet, right? And then there's lordosis, which is the opposite, so this part sticks out, could also be due to osteoporosis. Weight gain in pregnancy can also induce that kind of curvature on the body, so it's sort of sticking out of the stomach area. Now, aging, a lot happens as we get older, and osteoporosis is really associated with aging, particularly of women, which I'll talk about in a sec. But it's largely due to a loss of bone density. And now remember how the osteoblasts form, right? So the osteoblasts are formed from stem cells, bone stem cells. And as we get older, all of our stem cells become less active. So that's the first thing. So you're not going to be making as many osteoblasts, right? The other thing is that estrogen levels also drop, right? Remember I said estrogen was a better promoter of bone formation than, say, testosterone. So, and women's estrogen levels drop more dramatically than men, and that happens after menopause. Yes, men also need estrogen for this very reason. So postmenopausal women are the greatest risk, and it's said that many women will lose bone mass already at age 35. Okay, when we say women here, let's qualify that. So Caucasian women, right? So Caucasian women are at a greater risk. So if you look at on page 11, I put risks. That doesn't mean that non-Caucasian women don't get osteoporosis, but they're at less risk. So Caucasians have a higher risk of osteoporosis. So race can have an effect. Age, obviously, so as we get older. Gender, of course, right? Other things that can happen, smoking, diabetes, and poor diet can also affect that, okay? So basically, as one gets older, the bones just get more brittle, right? So you can sort of see a normal bone matrix versus osteoporosis. It's not that it's not mineralized, but there's greater spaces in the bone. So your bone density goes down, right? So the sort of the heft of your bone is going to go down, and those osteoclasts are going to be more active than the osteoblasts. And one of the reasons is you're just not making as many osteoblasts, right? And that is part of the thing. And then the other thing is that calcitonin isn't as active in an adult as it is in younger people. So anyways, so treatments. I don't have this on the slide, but in my notes, I have listed some treatments. Let me do that before I get into this. So treatments, included in that would be estrogen. So giving people estrogen. So that's called ERT, so estrogen replacement therapy. Drugs that will lower the effect of the osteoclasts or actually kill them off. So that would be drugs like Fosamax. That's the one you have to take. You have to be sitting up or something. You have it before breakfast. My mom used to take Fosamax. There's another one called Actonel. Don't know too much about that, but the effect is the same. How about taking parathyroid hormone, right? But that could lead to bone cancer. So apparently that is only done for a max of 2 years. And there's a drug called Forteo for that. And then exercise and a good diet to sort of stimulate the formation of bone naturally. So my mom, for example, is an osteoporosis very young, and she walks every day, and she takes calcium and vitamin D. So apparently she's been able to stop her bone loss, and she's 81, and she does not in any way, shape, or form look like this. So she has no curvature at all. But apparently she goes, I don't know if it's every second year, to do a bone density scan, and her density is less, but she's been able to control that, and largely due to her diet. And she's also vegetarian, by the way. It has been vegetarian since I was 12, so I'm going to tell you how long that is, but a long time. But exercise, she walks every day, all right? So she walks for maybe about an hour every day, and that increases the stress. And she also lifts 5-pound weights. She lays on the floor at night and she lifts some weights. So it's not like she goes to the gym and pumps iron, but she does try to do that as well. And it seems to be working. Anyhow, so there's that. Now I think I'm going to fix this slide. I'm going to re-upload this. But anyways, fractures. There's different types of fractures. I'm not getting you to remember all of these terms, but fractures are named by all kinds of different ways. So by their anatomical appearance and how many fragments and all kinds of stuff. So, so here you can see some. So partial, complete. So partial is obviously not all the way through the bone. Complete is all the way through. Simple is, or a closed fracture means it doesn't penetrate the skin, whereas open does puncture the skin. A green stick is sort of like if you're bending a twig, it doesn't go all the way through. This is a green stick fracture. Impacted, that one would be sort of like the squishing. There's communited. Oh, the communited. This is nasty. This is like more than 3 pieces. A spiral fracture is just what it sounds like. and then transverse and displaced. So there's all these different terms. So like non-displaced, so you can see that the bone isn't shifted, whereas displaced it is. So that, you know, you could have several of these terms referring to any one particular fracture. Okay, so just so you know. So here, these are the ones I really like, you know. So green stick, you can see it's the, you know, it's like breaking of a twig, just so that you learn some. And then the impacted, right? So the distal part is shoved into the proximal part. And then I know these look pretty horrendous. So open, so part of the bone has broken the skin. So open or compound. And then others, just because they're so common, are given a particular name. So Cole's fracture is always at the distal radius and ulna, is a Cole's fracture. In my notes, I have another one listed, Pott's fracture, which is the distal fibula. I have a picture of that. So that's another way that they're named. And then the last thing is bone healing. So there's 4 stages of healing bone. So the first stage is the hematoma formation. If you know the term hematoma, that's a blood clot. That happens in the first 6 to 8 hours. And it's associated with inflammation and swelling, right? So what's happening is that you're going to be recruiting your inflammatory cells. You're going to get macrophage in there to start clearing out debris. The fibroblasts are going to be recruited to start producing fibers. So remember, the osteoblasts are producing that collagen, but the fibroblasts will release you know, different types of fibers to sort of stabilize the region, and you're going to have this clot. Now, with time, that's going to be changed into what we call a soft callus. So the soft callus is cartilage. Now, we're going to talk later about hyaline cartilage. That's what you have from birth. And that's that nice glassy cartilage, if you remember talking about cartilage. And that's the type of cartilage you have in your epiphyseal plate, well, when you were young. But remember, fibrocartilage is the one that you get instead when you have some sort of damage. So this soft callus is cartilage, but it's specifically fibrocartilage, all right? So it's not that soft, glassy cartilage or that smooth, glassy cartilage. It's the one where you can see the collagen fibers in it. So you get this sort of soft callus first. And then you're going to have that endochondrial bone formation, right? So that cartilage is going to be converted to bone. So you're going to get a bony callus in step 3. So the osteoblasts are going to put a bony collar around there, just like they did when you're forming your long bones as a fetus. And you're first going to form a spongy bone, so but in your bony callus, and that is eventually going to be remodeled to your last one, which is, you know, the last step, which is bone remodeling. So that compact bone is going to be formed by your osteoblasts, and the osteoclasts are going to remove some of the fragments. And of course, there are interventions that we use as humans to help support this process. In your textbook, it goes through all kinds of different things. I don't think you need to learn all of that unless you end up being a nurse or a doctor or a PA in that particular field, but you'll learn those. But you probably know that you can put screws in and all that kind of thing to help stabilize these fragments. But in general, so a closed reduction is a procedure where the bone fragments are manipulated without surgery, and an open reduction is where you're going to have some sort of surgery that's involved to do that. And then, of course, a cast is going to be put on the outside to sort of immobilize that whole thing. So that could be done to support the closed or the open reduction, all right? And that sort of stabilizes the whole sort of system. Now, so I think that's the last slide. So what I'm going to do is what I did is, so this is sort of a new setup, but I'm going to just sort of shift some of these slides around just so you know. I think that for your studying purposes, when I was talking about the endochondrial bone formation and then the plates, I mean, just going through it and the way I wrote my notes, I'm going to move this slide up here sort of after this. I mean, my logic was that I sort of talked about the plates Um, but I think, no, I'll just leave it. It's fine because I talked you through it, but it's all right. I was just sort of thinking about it. You can give me some feedback if you think this works out all right. Yeah, I'll just leave it. But I will fix this because I don't like that. I don't know how that happened. I try to catch everything and I just don't. But there, so that looks a little prettier. Yeah, and then I saw another mistake. I'm just neurotic about it. You can watch me fix my slides. Oh, where is that other one? Here. Don't like that. That doesn't line up nicely. Oh my God, this is gonna make me crazy. Here I am trying to be a purist about my slides. That's so weird because that actually was something I tried. There we go. Hopefully that works, just to make it look prettier. I'm gonna save that. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. I don't know if there was other mistakes, but little things that I noticed while I talked you through this. And I'm gonna reload that. And that should be it. And hopefully that gets you going. And if you have any questions, let me know. And okay, good. Thanks a lot.